Hi, my name is Kim Davenport, and it is an honor to be with you this evening on behalf of Tacoma Historical Society. Before I start my presentation, we have a few words of welcome from our board president, Bill Barsma.
Through this live streaming of our meeting tonight, we are truly making history. I want to thank our Tacoma Historical Society Vice President Dale Worsing for inviting Kim Davenport to present this evening. Kim has an exciting program, and it too will make history. Now, as I mull over the challenges of this terrible pandemic, I think of my grandparents who in 1918 lived a block away from where I currently reside in the North End. They were confronting the great pandemic of the Spanish flu in that year, and I assume that they were keenly aware of and interested in the steps taken by the then mayor, Crockett Rydell, in dealing with this terrible illness. I wish they had chronicled their experiences in that fateful year, but they did not. In that regard, we urge you to keep a diary or journal recordings of your experiences and share those on our website. Kim will share more details about this and how to do this, as well as some other things we are doing to keep you engaged with Tacoma history during this unique time. I'm disappointed to report that this year we've had to cancel our May Historic Homes of Tacoma tour. It would have been our 26th annual tour. We had some great historic homes lined up. I want to thank the homeowners for agreeing to be a part of the tour this year. We are hopeful that we can reschedule the tour for later in the year, or if need be, next May. I do want to thank those of you who have contributed to the Tacoma Historical Society's annual appeal this year. Your contribution for any amount will be put to good use in keeping Tacoma history alive. In just a few moments, Kim will share more information about how to donate. Thank you for joining us this evening. Keep safe and be well.
With thanks to Bill for sharing those words with us, I am now going to, as they say, put on another hat. I've chosen this one from my hall closet, since of course I'm at home like the rest of you are. I'm calling this my THS Communications Manager hat. I will wear this to make some announcements on behalf of the organization, and then I'll take it off again when I give my presentation a little bit later, since I'm not actually a hat person. Just trying to bring a little levity into what is an unusual circumstance. We would normally be meeting in person and greeting each other, but to stay safe, we are keeping our distance and still sharing Tacoma history, even from a distance. So as Bill mentioned, I will start by talking about this diary project. We recognize that we are living through a historic moment, and therefore, as a historical society, it is important to us to capture as much as we can about this historic moment for future generations to better understand what we lived through. So we're inviting you, the link is here on the screen, it's also available right on our homepage. We're inviting you to submit your COVID-19 diary entries. Even if you don't think you have anything profound to share, you still have experiences to share. We all have experiences to share about this unique time that we're living through. You can fill out and submit the form as many times as you'd like. We will capture and save all of these submissions for use that we don't necessarily know what it will be yet, right? It might be part of an exhibit in the future, might be the source of some future historian's research, but whatever the use ends up being in the future, we will have captured something important about this present moment. Another project that we've been engaged in is the recording of our first audiobook. We chose to start with this title that you see pictured here, Rising Up. This is one of the earliest titles in our 21 Tales series. These books are geared towards K through 8 and especially middle school, junior high age school kids, teaching stories from Tacoma history. And each of the books contains 21 examples of a particular theme. We decided to start with this one in this unique time because this book tells stories of Tacoma rising past challenge, and that's exactly what we need to be doing right now. So if you are someone who is interested in learning more interesting stories about Tacoma history, if you have a middle school aged child at home and you're working on some homeschooling, this is a great opportunity to experience some of those stories even though you can't actually get out to our museum and buy a physical copy of the book, you can still listen. I want to send out great thanks to Deb Friedman, co-author of the book, for getting out a recorder in her living room and recording her reading of these stories. So thank you, Deb, for doing that for us. As Bill mentioned, we have received many responses to our annual appeal, and we thank those of you who have donated. If you still have that annual appeal letter sitting at home and haven't yet mailed it in, you are still welcome to do so. Even though our museum is closed, we are still checking our P.O. box, so we will get your donation. You're also welcome, of course, to donate on our website, and that link is here. And every dollar that comes in goes directly towards our mission of keeping Tacoma history alive. Another great way to support us is by becoming a member, or if you're already a member, by renewing your membership. So here's that link. For anyone who's not familiar with the benefits, they are many. First of all, you receive advance notice of events that we have coming up. Always stay in the loop. You receive discounts on some of the events that we actually do charge admission for, although most of our events are actually free to the public. A discount in our museum store. And probably most importantly for those interested in Tacoma history, our newsletter. So on that note, if you are a member, you should have received within the last few days an emailed version of our newsletter. It's always been in paper form up to this point, but we can't currently have envelope stuffing parties with our great volunteers. So we decided we didn't want to make you wait. You should have that newsletter in your inbox. If you don't, that means we don't have a current email address for you. So please reach out to us. Send a note to info@tacomahistory.org. Let us know any changes to email, phone, address, so we can update our records. All right, and I have some very exciting news to share. This is new news to most of you, other than those who would have read all the way to the bottom of an email I sent recently to members. We are gearing up to move. So we've been at our 919 Pacific location for several years now. We are out of space. We are bursting at the seams. We're running out of storage space. We're also facing increased lease rates. So it was a good opportunity for us to look to a new location. Our board has just approved to pursue a lease arrangement on a space that would be new to us in the Stadium District near Wright Park. That's as much detail as I can share right now, but it's exciting for us because it's a much bigger space. It will allow us to have larger and more climate-controlled storage space for our collection, which is very important. Larger space for our museum exhibits, and potentially also public meetings to be held in our own space, which is not something we've been able to do in the past. A few other perks like some off-street parking. So we're really excited about this and ask for you to stay tuned for news in the coming months. Because of the current COVID situation, the move will have to be gradual, but we expect and hope that it can be completed by the end of summer. All right, and then finally, this is my last announcement, and this is actually brand new news that I'm just breaking in this presentation here. We have a crossword puzzle challenge for you on our website. It is a notable Tacomans crossword puzzle. So hopefully a fun activity for students of Tacoma history of all ages, maybe something good for the family to do together. And we're also offering a chance for you to win some great prizes if you want to complete this crossword puzzle and then send it in to us. So complete instructions on our website, but essentially if you send us a complete and accurate crossword puzzle by the end of April, we will have a drawing of all those entries for a free family membership and choice of one of our THS Press book titles. So that's exciting. Learn and also win all at the same time. All right, I think this is the moment that I will remove my hat. Yes, it is. Back to my normal hatless self. I now become nerdy music history researcher of Tacoma, Kim Davenport. She doesn't wear a hat. All right, I want to start with just an introduction to how I got engaged in this research in the first place. And then this presentation is really just a few vignettes. I have lots more of this type of story that I could share with you, but we don't have endless time to have you watch my little talking head on YouTube. So I'll keep it as brief as I can. But first of all, how did I get into this in the first place? I come from a long line of musicians and a long line of music teachers, many of whom worked and lived in Tacoma. And as I've continued to explore my family roots in Tacoma, and as someone who enjoys exploring local history research, those have been the stories I've been drawn to. Stories of musicians, stories of music teachers, stories of the ways in which music is a reflection of our community. And I had an interesting conversation recently with some members of our staff as we gear up for an exhibit about the musical history of Tacoma, which was what makes Tacoma unique in this regard. Certainly, any city, any town could boast maybe a famous musician that was born there or a great band that was formed in their city. Any city could tell stories like that. What's unique about Tacoma? So in my experience, what's unique is the waves of immigration in the early 20th century, many of them that were all different in their and unique in their own ways. The boom time of Tacoma being seen as the city of destiny. This will be the next great city in the United States, and all of the arts and music that would go along with that. The diversity brought by things like the port and Camp Lewis, then Fort Lewis, and a really strong sense of community and musicians and teachers and bands working together, helping one another, one generation helping to get the careers started of the next. These are things that seem to me to be uniquely Tacoma about the stories I encounter when I learn about musicians from Tacoma history. So just want to share again a few vignettes with you, some of my favorite stories from this history. And we're going to begin where I really think this story does begin, which is with the building of the Tacoma Theater and one of the first musicians that was brought to Tacoma by the Tacoma Theater. So here is a sort of artist's, architect's rendering of what this theater was to be. It looks kind of fantastical, I've always thought. It looks like, well, they couldn't possibly have actually built that. This was erected in 1888 and opened in 1890 at the corner of 9th and Broadway, right between where the Pantages now stands and the Rialto now stands. This building used to stand. And it was intended to be, and it was for a great time, the largest stage, the grandest theater north of San Francisco and west of the Mississippi. And because we had the train bringing people here and we had this grand theater, the design was we would bring the greatest artists of the time to perform here, whether musicians or comedians or great speakers or great actors. It was also a place for many community meetings, a very important structure in the early history of Tacoma. Here is what it actually looked like in photographic detail, actually quite similar to that architect's rendering. And many, many great musicians performed in this venue. I have a few examples here on this slide. One of the first stories I researched, because my grandmother talked about this concert, was when Rachmaninoff performed in Tacoma in 1925. John Philip Sousa came to Tacoma many times over the years, and one of his first appearances was at the Tacoma Theater. This is an image from the program from February 27th, 1901, when Sousa's band played that stage. Jascha Heifetz, the great violinist. There are hundreds and hundreds more examples. It was a truly grand stage. There's a great story about Ben-Hur in its theatrical version with live horses being staged on this theater stage because it was one of the only venues that could actually handle the live horses. So that gives you an idea of how grand and big this venue was. But the person I want to talk about for a few minutes is Olaf Bull. Olaf Bull was a Swedish, originally, violinist. He was born in Sweden in 1852, made his way to the United States as a very young man, already talented and established as a violinist, had a great career going. He spent some time in Boston, he spent some time in New York and Chicago, but it was the lure of this interesting new opportunity to be the orchestra leader at this new theater, the Tacoma Theater, that brought him to Tacoma. And because of that opportunity, and also because of our great Mount Rainier, he stayed. Olaf Bull was fascinated with mountaineering. He made 2 summits of the mountain, They are pictured here by a great photographer by the name of Waite, W-A-I-T-E, who also happened to be a piano tuner. So these two men probably would have known each other in either context. And Olaf Bull is known actually not only for being a great violinist and an important leader in Tacoma's early musical scene, but also the first person to play the violin at the top of Mount Rainier. So this is an example of the kind of story that I really love about this research. It's not so much just the music, it's the way in which music is an integral part of all of our lives. It's the way in which musicians aren't just musicians, they are also teachers, writers, mountain climbers. They also do other things to engage in our world. And there are unique things about Tacoma, like our mountain, that bring people here and encourage them to stay and make their lives here. Olaf Bull indeed did make his life here. He went through several attempts to get a Tacoma symphony started. You notice the program on the left of the screen here actually is a Tacoma Symphony Orchestra program, a very, very early one. It says first season, third concert. But there was never quite enough financial support in his day to get that organization off the ground. But he really laid the groundwork, taught an innumerable number of young musicians who would then go on to their own musical careers here and elsewhere. Really a foundational musician in the early years of our city. All right, moving on to another favorite story of mine, and one that's really well suited to early April, since that's where we are right now. This is the story of the Lincoln High School a cappella choir in 1938, making a grand trip across the country, taking daffodils to cities and states far and wide, along with their singing and their vocal talent. So here is that choir. And at the bottom left, you see their teacher, Mrs. Margaret Goheen. This is a teacher who spent her entire career at Lincoln High School, and she built a world-class, really, choral program from the ground up. She had thousands of students go through this program in her 30 years at Lincoln, and they won many, many awards, made multiple recordings, were really an important part of the cultural fabric of our city. From the 1930s through about the mid-1950s, she handed the reins over to other teachers who kept it going for a little bit longer as well. This group of young people that you see smiling into the camera here were coming out of the Depression. This picture was taken in the fall of 1937. Also, Lincoln was, in terms of the financial standing of the students, the more working class of Tacoma's two high schools at the time, the other high school being Stadium. I researched the parents, the families of these students. These were either unemployed parents of these students or people working in very common, very essential jobs, coming out of the Depression, trying to have a financial standing. So when they were presented with an opportunity to travel to St. Louis for a choral festival, this was the first time that any musical ensemble west of the Mississippi had ever been invited to this national contest. There was a question of whether they would be able to afford to go. Their families certainly could not raise the money. And so at this moment in Tacoma history, coming out of the Depression, when the Daffodil Festival was just a few years in existence, the entire city got behind this effort to send these students to St. Louis. In the picture that you see at the center of the screen is actually the first picture that I found that started telling me this story and got me into researching it more. And I'll read the banner that's in the background of the picture in case you can't see it. It says, Lincoln High School 60 Voices a cappella choir extend greetings and good wishes from Tacoma, Washington, America's evergreen playground. And this banner was hung on the train car that took these students all across the country. So there were fundraisers held for several months to raise the money to send the group. The business community, other students in other schools around Tacoma, all raising money. And it was quickly realized by politicians, business leaders, that this was an opportunity to reach out to the rest of the country and say, hey, don't forget about Tacoma. This is a pretty great place going on over there on the West Coast, and here's some of our finest young people to represent us. Because it was coinciding with the Daffodil Festival, Their performance was in early April in St. Louis. The train car that took them was filled with daffodils, thousands of daffodils. They would stop in each major town or city, hand out daffodils, and sing from the train car, making quite an impression. This is a telegram documenting the fact that the choir actually appeared live on national radio. In this era, before we had television or any of the many other ways we have now of sharing music, this was a really big deal for this high school choir to be featured on NBC radio. Here is the group while on their trip. I believe, if I remember correctly, this photograph is from St. Louis. The students having a great time. Most of them had never spent an overnight on a train. Most of them had never left the state of Washington. So this was a really immense experience for these students. And while we're on the topic of Lincoln High School and Mrs. Goheen's career, I wanted to share one other story. I have two photographs here, both of which feature Paul Robeson, a very significant figure from the 20th century, a fine bass baritone singer. That's why I'm talking about him in this context, but also an important civil rights leader, actor, a one-time college football star, really an interesting and diverse life. Very interesting collaboration between Paul Robeson and Mrs. Goheen. And that brings us to this fantastic photograph. This was taken backstage at the Temple Theater. You see Paul Robeson as the tall, strong figure in the front singing with his accompanist at the piano. Mrs. Goheen is conducting her Lincoln High School choir. This was in November of 1941. This was the first time that Robeson came to perform in Tacoma. And he was here to perform a piece called Ballad for Americans, which was a patriotic piece written during wartime, kind of glorifying American history. And he normally performed it with professional choirs. So the fact that he would decide and choose to rehearse and perform with a high school choir really says a lot about the quality of that musical program. I have just a little bit of audio for you here. This is not audio with the Lincoln Choir, but you can hear Paul Robeson's impressive and imposing voice.
Yes, mister. Tell us who you are.
You see, I represent the whole of home. That's it.
Let my people go.
That's the idea. Old Abe Lincoln was thin and long. His heart was high and his faith was strong. But he hated oppression, he hated wrong. And he went down to his grave to free the slave.
Man in white, it can never be great. While in white, property, slave on me. And we here hiding long and we lay down on and dying fair. All the people, by the people, and for the people,
Shall not perish from the earth.
All right, and just one more photograph of this Lincoln group because it tells another important story. This is another example of my interest in music history, bringing me to broader areas of history and broader understanding. This is the Lincoln Choir with Mrs. Goheen at the bottom right there. They're in their robes, but this is an interesting venue. They are performing for a room exclusively filled with African American soldiers during World War II, when we still had segregated military troops and segregated USO depots for entertainment of servicemen. And so this story tells really a fascinating, this picture tells really a fascinating story in that regard. So in addition to being a fine choir, they also did a lot of community service, and this is just one example of that. All right, moving on to our next story. I want to share the story with you of Joe Jordan. This is an example of someone who would have had no connection to Tacoma had it not been for Fort Lewis. And there are many examples, I'm sure in other fields as well, but my interest being in music, I seem to find the musical ones, many examples of musicians being brought to this area by the military. So I'm going to start with another Lincoln High School tie-in, just because that's a nice segue from our previous topic. But before I get into this example, I'll explain Joe Jordan, born in 1882. He was a composer of the ragtime era. He's going back into very much a previous era, even though his years in Tacoma extend all the way into the early 1970s. He lived a very long life. And he had an extremely illustrious career. He did productions on Broadway. He traveled Europe for many years, composing, arranging. He was back in the vaudeville era, so he was writing songs to be sung on vaudeville stages. He once collaborated in Harlem in a production with Orson Welles of a Shakespeare play that he was putting on. So fascinating, illustrious career, also an example of an African-American musician dealing with a lot of discrimination, having to perform in blackface minstrel shows in order to get his music performed, making very difficult choices like that a lot of African-American musicians did in this era. So what brings him to Tacoma? He is already well along in his middle-age years by the time World War II comes around, but he is recruited by the military and he is made Captain Joe Jordan, even though he's well past fighting age, for a specific purpose. I mentioned earlier that our troops were still segregated. Well, that was starting to change, right? We have the presidential order to desegregate the troops. But before that happens, we still have bases with segregation. We still have the need to provide entertainment, housing, food, everything for two separate groups of troops. And on the entertainment side, there was a need for musicians to provide entertainment for white troops, black troops, separate venues. And Joe Jordan was recruited for that purpose. He ended up his last post being at Fort Lewis, and he fell in love with this area. He fell in love with Mount Rainier. He fell in love with the community and remained here for the rest of his life. One of the things he did was to write a new school song for Lincoln High School. That's the slide we've been looking at here for quite a while. And he never seemed to tire of writing music, even though in his retirement in Tacoma he went into real estate. You couldn't stop Joe Jordan from continuing to write music. He wrote a song for the Giants when Cheney Stadium opened and we had our first AAA baseball team here. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
Baseball time is here once more again. Go and see our Giants score again. Go on, hit the ball out in the field. Watch those Giants and the bases they steal. We hope the pennant is in sight again. Giants try with all your might again. Go, go, Giants, and win today. We're with you, Giants, all the way.
All right, just a taste of that, and I'll give you just a taste of this one as well. He also wrote new songs both for the city of Tacoma in honor of its centennial, and he also proposed a new song for the state of Washington. And actually our legislative delegation from this area did push for this to become the new official state song. That was a failed effort along with the Louie Louie effort that happened a bit later as well. But clearly this was a man who, after a long career in music and composition, fell in love with a new community and did all that he could to keep contributing what it was he contributed, which was music. Let's listen to a little bit of his proposed State of Washington song.
100 years of progress, 100 years of success, 100 years of sweat and toil, with ups and downs and strain and stress.
All right. Moving on to my last vignette, I want to talk about the importance of rock and roll in Tacoma, and specifically, because of course there's a lot to talk about here, and I wanted to narrow it down, specifically the lasting influence of some of Tacoma's earliest rock bands. I'm going to touch on the Wailers and the Sonics, but really what I'm after here is an understanding that what was happening musically here in the 1950s still is impacting musicians today. And that's one of the things I think is really interesting about Tacoma's musical story. So you might recognize this picture of these gentlemen. This is the band known as the Fabulous Wailers. And I'm going to pull up some audio in just a moment. I'll explain what it is first because it's a little bit raucous and hard to hear. But this audio that you will hear in a moment is the Wailers appearing on the Bandstand radio show before it later became a television show with Dick Clark, if you recognize that voice as the person talking to them. And the reason I'm playing this for you is to illustrate just how young these young men were when they first hit it big. And that's a thought I'll ask you to hold for another story I'll be telling.
Just sneak over here. There you are. All righty. Peace. You gentlemen came a long way. Have you ever been to Philadelphia before? No. It's usually not this noisy, We're swinging a little bit today. Summer is up here and the whole thing. Your home is in Tacoma, Washington? Washington, yes. Somebody told me that you happened to fall together almost by accident. Is this true?
Yes. It was, we had jam sessions, sort of a city deal. And we decided, well, people wanted a rock and roll band, so we just started up.
How long ago was this?
About 10 months ago.
You fellas can't be very old. May I do what we do here normally, ask your name and age?
John Grieg, 18.
Kent Morrill, 18.
Mike Brick, 16.
This is the smartest drummer I know. He stands on a platform. Usually we get the drummer buried back. You're lucky to get his eyebrows, huh? Good to see you up there.
Mark Bruce, 18. Rich Stengel, 16.
So you're the baby then, huh? Does he bear watching? Do you have to watch him because he's the youngest man in the group?
Right.
You don't find this true. Who is the worry ward here? Who worries about getting you to someplace on time?
This guy right back here.
He looks like the worrying kind. There you. How old did you say you were?
16.
He's another 16-year-old worrier, huh?
All right, so 16, 17, 18-year-olds. The reason I chose to share that audio, they hit it big really fast. They flew to the East Coast. They were recording, performing, appearing on national radio and later television. And they ended up deciding they weren't ready for the big time, and they decided to come back to Tacoma. So hold that thought. That'll be important in a moment. Here was their first big hit. You can see, if you can see it well enough, that this record was recorded in New York. So this band decides to not keep pursuing the national travel and keep trying to make it big by leaving town. They missed their families. They wanted to finish high school. Coming back to Tacoma, then the question is, how do we keep going? Well, great solution, form your own record label. You don't necessarily need to keep flying around the country trying to impress record company executives. If you have your own label here with some support from some important Tacoma musicians. I didn't mention him in this presentation today, but Art Mineo, another longtime Tacoma musician brought here by Fort Lewis, who was from an older generation, a jazz generation, was integral in getting this Etiquette Records label off the ground, encouraging the group to set up their own label. And this leads us to the fact that then the Wailers are able to support other bands, for example, the Sonics, a slightly younger group with a slightly new and different sound, by having a local label here right in Tacoma. So here are the Sonics. We are now into the 1960s with the Sonics. And let me play just a little bit of audio for you. You're going to hear some reminiscence of what we heard from the Wailers, but also some brand new sound. Rock and roll is changing. interrupt that audio. There is a direct line connecting the Wailers and the other early Tacoma rock bands to the Sonics through that label, through other connections, musicians who played in multiple bands, to the later grunge movement, which was so important and so significant nationwide and was typically defined as being based out of Seattle. But so much of that sound, so many of those musical ideas originated from Tacoma bands. We're going to listen to one current grunge artist talking about the influence of the Sonics.
It's everything about the Sonics that was influential to me. The guitar sound is just so gritty. The vocals are amazing. The drummer is so propulsive. It's such great stuff. And I had when I first heard the Sonics, I was not singing in a band, so I had no idea that a few years later that Jerry Rousley would be one of my vocal models. One of the people that I really looked to in terms of how this should be done. Some of the covers that they do, Dirty Robber, the Wailers song, that's awesome, and Have Love Will Travel, and they do the best Louie Louie by far. Of any of the many Louie Louies that I've heard, theirs is by far the best. I think there was people who hungered for something that was better than the commercial crap of the day, of the 70s and the 80s and now. And I think there'll always be people who are drawn to the Sonics and the Wailers and good raw rock bands.
All right, so that brings us to the end of the vignettes of Tacoma music history that I wanted to share with you tonight. I do have a blog where I share more of these types of stories, tacomamusichistory.org, and I also am on the various social media channels. I tend to post something every day, usually a historic photograph that tells some sort of story from Tacoma music history. So stay tuned and keep listening and learning. I hope I've intrigued you with some things to go look up on YouTube after you finish watching this video. I would highly recommend the Sonics if you haven't heard the Sonics before. And also just a quick teaser that there is a book drafted, another in the series of our 21 Tales books that I've put together featuring 21 important musicians from Tacoma history, including some of the people I talked about tonight and several others. And we also are gearing up to have a music-themed exhibit at Tacoma Historical Society, hopefully in our new location towards the end of 2020. I've been very excited to be involved in that, and we hope to welcome you to come see that when we are able to start meeting in person again. So just one last slide here. I'm the only one who's been able to be here in person because, of course, we're all operating out of our separate houses right now, but I want to, if I can, speak on behalf of everyone at Tacoma Historical Society, the board, our staff, our many volunteers. Thank you for watching. Stay well, stay safe, and stay tuned to our website. We will keep adding new material to hopefully help keep you engaged with Tacoma history through this strange time that we are living through right now. And look forward to seeing you again as soon as that is possible in person. Thank you very much.